Welcome to this pre-concert talk with the RSNO and our section Principals Profile Month. For this performance of the Mozart Oboe Concerto, we have our fabulous section principal oboe, Adrian Wilson.
Hello.
Welcome, Adrian.
Hello.
We're going to be talking a little bit about the piece that you're performing. Performed on the best instrument in the orchestra. I'm the associate principal oboe in the orchestra, so it's a fantastic privilege to be interviewing my boss. So, Adrian, the Mozart Oboe Concerto. Just tell us a little bit about the background of the history of the piece.
So it's an interesting history, the Oboe Concerto by Mozart, because originally it was thought of as a flute concerto. We knew that Mozart had written an oboe concerto through several letters that he'd written, but we thought that it was lost. And it wasn't until 1920 where the orchestral parts were discovered in the Mozarteum in Salzburg. And we realized that the original was in fact the oboe concerto in C major, and Mozart had transposed this piece into D major for a commission that he'd been asked to write by the amateur flautist Ferdinand Dijon.
Now we know, of course, that the Mozart wasn't a fan of the flute, and so it's clear that the oboe version of the concerto is absolutely superior. So what characteristics of the oboe do you think are showcased in this concerto?
I think we have to remember that the concerto was written for the Salzburg oboist Giuseppe Ferlandis, but then taken on very much by Mozart's favourite oboist Friedrich Ramm, who was the principal in the Munich orchestra. And we know that Mozart was very fond of his playing, and especially his high register, which in the day was extraordinary. And of course, Mozart then wrote the oboe quartet for him and really pushed the limits of the instrument in terms of its tessitura. So a lot of this concerto, especially in the second movement, you'll hear sustained lines in the very high register, which takes a lot of stamina and control. But apart from that, it's a very nimble and very agile concerto. I mean, he marks the first movement allegro aperto, which means literally open, sort of generous. He writes that same marking in the A major violin concerto. And I think it really shows the strength of the oboe's character of being an instrument that can really project in a very articulate way. But I guess the main point is that Mozart is one of the geniuses compositionally. He understood how instruments really work, and he really plays to the strengths of the oboe in as far as playing long, sustained, beautiful melodies. I mean, the second movement is effectively an aria straight out of one of his operas.
Yeah, it's a fantastic movement. When you're coming to the point where you're about to perform the piece, what's the kind of primary thought in your mind that you're hoping to communicate?
I think with Mozart especially, in a way, opera is never far from his thoughts, from his compositional process and his thoughts. So I think whereas the first movement is clearly very energetic, and then in the second movement we've got this beautiful aria, which for me it's a singing, but it feels like it's not an overt singing. It's more someone singing to themselves in a sort of more innig a way. So that it's a bit like you could name a number of arias from Mozart operas that sort of use that style. But of course, the third movement is, we really know that he's thinking about opera because he actually later took the theme of this movement and inserted it into his opera Die Entführung aus dem Serail in the aria Welche Wonne, welche Lust, where Blanchen is talking about her great joy and her great happiness at receiving the great news from Pedrillo. If I just
Go for it.
play, if I can find it, read, I'll show you what I mean. So In the opera, he marks the aria in a tempo of allegro, and it's in G major. And so for the concerto, it's modified back into C major, the key of the concerto, and it's marked to allegretto, so it's slightly slower, but you can certainly tell it's the same material. So it's that he's thinking already in a really operatic style. So I think when one approaches this piece, you almost need to have sort of opera characters in your head to get the maximum character out of the piece. And so that's something that I think about when I'm
Fantastic.
preparing this work.
So, on the instrument of the day, what would the sound be like compared to a modern French instrument that you're playing there?
Well, of course, the instruments of the day would have been made of boxwood, which is a lighter wood. It would have made a lighter sound for sure. But I think the thing that's quite interesting is that the development of the instrument at that time was massive. I mean, from the Baroque oboe to the classical oboe, in a way, is a much bigger step than the classical oboe is to the oboe of today. So what would have happened is as the size of the orchestras grew bigger, we needed an instrument that could project more. And so the size of the internal bore became smaller to give more projection. There would have been a lot more key work added. So in Baroque times, there would have been hardly any key work on the instrument at all. But obviously, as music became more chromatic, the instruments needed more key work to facilitate the playing of the chromatic scale much more quickly. So there would have been a whole lot more key work going on, octave keys, to facilitate playing in the higher registers. So it makes you realize that the virtuosi of the day, to have got round these works with their cross fingerings and lack of keys, they must have been incredible. I mean, the other thing is, of course, there was much less standardization of instruments. So, for instance, if Mozart was traveling from Salzburg to Munich or to Vienna, they would have had completely different instruments and possibly playing at different pitches as well. So, in general terms, I think learning those instruments would have been a lot more tricky.
And so it's almost a shame that those sort of fluctuating characteristics have sort of been minimised over the years in a way. But anyway, that's for a different day. So I'm interested with the as you're going to see in the performance coming up, you'll see the orchestra is socially distanced for COVID reasons. Did that make the experience any different for you, standing in front of that a more dispersed bunch of musicians?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the thing that stood out for me was that the dialogue that happens between the solo parts and the orchestral parts, when you're standing within the orchestra, you're a tighter-knit group of players, you get much more of a feel of dialogue between the instruments, and that you're able to show more physically as to where phrases are going. That this performance relied a lot more on trust, that what you're trying to show is somehow filtering back much larger distances.
Where does the conductor fit into that that dynamic as well? I mean, have you done this piece unconducted before?
I haven't done it unconducted, no.
Right.
I've done it a few times with orchestra, but I suppose in a similar way. The conductor has to, it's a wind instrument, the sort of feeling of knowing where a soloist is going to breathe, and that feeling of something that might just change very slightly at the last minute, especially in the last movement, in the rondo, because that phrase that I played keeps on coming back, and quite often after some pauses, And so for a conductor to catch that downbeat is quite tricky at the best of times. But when you're spaced apart, obviously that probably makes their job a little bit more difficult.
Yeah. It's often said that, it's one of the kind of acid tests for a conductor. If they can really conduct a concerto really well and coordinate all the musicians and the soloist on stage, that is sort of, that's one of the tests of a really finely skilled conductor. I'm really one of the things I'm curious about being an oboe player myself, as the years kind of tick over that we've both been doing this, involved in this profession. What are the sort of specific technical demands of this piece that you still find, tricky to or that take preparation or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why this piece is used as audition material, because it's well, I mean, a lot of Mozart's like this, where every note matters. There are no sort of extraneous notes. It's every note has its place and its purpose. And I think, so from a technical point of view, the trills are something that, to get every trill neat and get the turn in place, and so sometimes the trill is within a melody, to make it sort of sound that it's not something that's just been added on for sort of sugar, but that it's part of the cake. So that from a technical point of view, getting all the trills neat is something that I have to work very hard at. But I suppose probably the most difficult thing is the stamina required to sustain playing long lines, especially up in the higher register, and have that stability up there too. It's actually, the second movement sounds simple, but it's actually very demanding. And it's one of those ironies, isn't it? That how often the most beautiful, simple music is actually the hardest to play, and actually requires the most concentration and the most work. So that's something that I find, I feel like I have to be in really good physical shape to actually cope with the demands of especially that second movement.
Yeah. And you prove that you are. So, just on a slight tangent, what's the most outrageous situation you've ever played this concerto in?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that question. There was once an audition which I did, which required the exposition of the first movement of the Mozart concerto. Now, as a lot of people will know, that before I play the oboe in rehearsal or concert, I always brush my teeth. And that's largely because if I've had a cheeky snack of chocolate or a banana or something in the break, any remnants of that going down the reed doesn't do it any favors. So I'm always brushing my teeth. Anyway, on this said day, I was running a bit late for the audition, and so I arrived and they said, we're ready, whenever you're ready, and said, yeah, okay, I just need to go and brush my teeth, which I did. But unfortunately, because I was in a bit of a panic, I managed to squeeze not toothpaste onto my toothbrush, but an antiseptic Savlon cream, which took me a few seconds to realize after I brushed it. But then, of course, my mouth went numb. And so I had to perform this with a really funny sensation in my mouth.
How did it go?
It actually was one of the best auditions I've ever done, and I got a trial.
Wow, I wasn't expecting to hear that. That's a good one.
Other brands of antiseptic cream also available.
Yeah, on numbing agents, should you require one. Okay, so there's quite one of the things that we're hoping to do with these pre-concert talks is spread a little bit of advice for any students that might be studying this piece or studying the oboe in general. And it's a lifelong of learning, but it's a very special period when you start to learn a piece such as this that you will spend the rest of your days with. I know you alluded to trills earlier about something that you continually need to work on with this piece. If you were coaching a student starting to learn it, what would be your sort of advice for a sort of initial plan of attack?
Well, interestingly, I think my initial plan, whenever I revisit this piece, because the danger is, of course, when you know your own weaknesses and pitfalls, is that you head directly towards the sort of minutiae and go, right, I'm going to work out the trills and I'm going to make sure that they fit in nicely. But actually, I think that the first port of call should always be to be thinking about the line and how the phrasing is affected by the harmony, as it so often is. Because if we get too bogged down by small technique, we have to remember that the whole purpose of technique is just a function of being able to fulfill your musical ideas and imagination. And so I think my first attack is always to actually get rid of all trills and all fast notes and actually just play the bare bones of the phrases to really feel like I'm understanding the direction that the air needs to flow. So that would be my first port of call, definitely. And that's also very useful for memorizing as well, because I think if you understand the structure and how the harmonies are moving through that structure, it really helps you understand where you are in the piece and where you've come from and where you're going.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing, because it sort of links back to what you were saying earlier on about, what are the characteristics of the piece. It's a very operatic piece. It's all about, so that links in with flow and air and structure. So.
Yeah, so I mean, so for instance, in the last movement, the theme that I played, I'd probably want to start something like, or something like that, so that you really get a feel of where the line is going without, before you start putting all the fiddly bits in, which can unfortunately trip you up in terms of the flow of the line.
Reeds. Double reed instrument. The oboe is a double reed instrument, and players spend many hours whittling, scraping, gouging, cane, as you will as well, as for part of your job. Is there anything specific in terms of reeds for the Mozart concerto which you could advise?
I mean, I think at the end of the day, you need to find a reed that is light enough that will allow you to articulate and express what you need to express. It's very easy to fall into the trap of going with a reed that has this big bloomy sound, and you've practiced all this technique to get everything neat, and then at the end of the day, the reed doesn't allow you to do that because it doesn't have enough vibrancy or speakiness, as I like to call it. So yeah, always err on the side of a reed that's light, because also stamina-wise, you need something that's not going to tire you out too much. It's a very tiring work. So yeah, my advice would be to see how light a reed you dare play. Work at it from that end.
Yeah. Oh, Chris, great advice. A little bit of nuts and bolts. Editions, of course. Any particular edition that you use or recommend people to get? Because of course, in this day and age, someone learning the piece might just go and get whatever's available online, which may not get you the best result.
I've always used the Barenreiter Urtext edition. It's the only edition I've used, and quite frankly, you can tell because the copy is a complete and utter, the pages are all over the place. I've lost the front cover as well.
Fantastic. In the actual performance and the sessions themselves, did I see you had a full score as well?
Yes, that is the full score. I actually only ever work from the full score. That's partly because I actually lost the oboe part. I've never got around to buying a new one.
And here was me thinking it underpins, what you were saying before about understanding the structure of the work. Oh, damn.
No, it's
fantastic.
But actually, seriously though, I really do think that if you're wanting to learn something from memory, which I think is a great thing because it forces you to really understand the music on a much deeper level. That to learn from the score, you've constantly got an understanding of what the bass is doing, where the parts are moving. You know, sometimes when you know, for instance, when you're standing in front of the orchestra, to just literally know the geography of what's going on behind you, is the violin line that you're playing with the first violins or the second violins, because you need to know where to listen and where to look. So I think it's very important to work from the score.
Fantastic.
Right from the very beginning,
Yeah.
I think, to really understand how your part relates.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have any particular favourite recordings of the piece, or any performances you've seen of players that have really inspired you with this piece?
That's a really interesting question. I think there are so many recordings out there, so many amazing performances. I think you need to be very careful to know what you're looking for, because in my experience there are many recordings where the soloist appears more important than the music, and vice versa. And it's a question of what you're looking for, where it sits. Because it's interesting, it's a piece of Mozart, it has its language, but of course Mozart wrote this piece for someone specifically in mind to show off their virtuosity. So in a way that both arguments are valid, but for your own sensibility to understand what is it that you're looking for, because there are some fantastic, I'm not naming names, but there are some amazing virtuosic performances which are incredibly impressive, but might not necessarily be to my taste. And so I think the thing is that you take, like from any lesson you might have with any teacher, at the end of the day, you take from it the things that you believe are important, and you accept the view of those things that you don't think are important, but realize that that's someone's view, might not necessarily work for you. You know, some of the most beautiful performances I've heard have not actually been overly virtuosic, but they've been just simply beautiful, and that can speak to you more than if someone is playing it, you know, 4 notches up on the metronome.
A much more kind of like obvious way of sort of individualizing concerto performances is via the cadenzas, and of course, interesting that this concerto has a cadenza in every movement. What are your sort of thought processes with cadenzas, and also if you're, say, for example, talking to someone who's approaching the cadenzas in terms of learning or writing or constructing?
Okay, so first off, I am certainly by no means a brilliant cadenza writer. I discovered that quite early on. So in fact, in this performance, the first movement cadenza is my own, but the second movement was written by one of my old teachers, Dougie Boyd, and the last movement cadenza was written by one of his teachers, Maurice Borg. So there's a kind of nice lineage there. In terms of writing cadenzas, I think it's fairly important to think about using the material that's already there. And I think I always sort of wanted to work along the lines of the flautist Joachim Quantz, who suggested that certainly cadenzas in wind concertos should be capable of being played in one breath. And I think that the large danger that I often hear is that cadenzas become too long, too rambling, and actually lose the point of them, which is to kind of build the themes in tension until you get to the resolution point at the trill, which brings you back into the original material. I find it always a bit disappointing when cadenzas sort of are a bit too stop start, and you sort of feel like you've lost your way. I think in a way our job as a soloist in a cadenza is it's almost like holding the audience's hand and saying, this is where I'm taking this harmonically, and I'm going to finally bring you back to the key of the tonic. So I think that would be my approach. Whether I was successful or not is another matter. But
Absolutely, you were successful. So, of course, as we were saying, this piece is often done for auditions, and with or without numbing agents. What's the shortest audition you've ever played with this concerto?
Okay.
Or have you always made it to the end of the exposition?
No. I mean, interestingly, I once did an audition for a principal oboe job, actually in an orchestra you're very familiar with, the orchestra, the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra. And I did an audition in London, of which the entirety of the audition lasted 3 minutes. So I'm not sure what proportion of that 3 minutes was the concerto, but I'm guessing it was about 45 seconds. It was one of the first auditions I'd ever done. And I have to say, I came out of it thinking, is that it? I put all that preparation into this audition. And I didn't hear anything from them for 6 months. And I was getting a bit, I was sort of really disillusioned. Not only did I only play for 3 minutes, but they didn't have the decency to send me a no letter. But then actually I was very surprised that I got an email in my inbox 6 months later inviting me out there for 6 weeks. So it just goes to show you never know.
You never know. You never know where you can end up. That wasn't by any chance Matthias Bammert and James Judd in a recording device. I think I was there. I would have been like on the same day or the day before or something like that. Wow. Small world. In auditions, how many times do you think you've actually played the first movement exposition in?
Well, at least 3 times for this orchestra, because I got my job on the 3rd time of asking, so I literally battered them into submission, I think. Oh, not him again, we'll give him the job.
Just keep playing till they give you the job.
So that's 3 times for this orchestra. Oh, I don't know. I must have played it 20, 30 times, maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very unusual to not be asked it. Although the one thing I would add as a word of advice is don't just learn the exposition, because it has happened to me before where, usually orchestras ask for the exposition, and that's what you're expected to play, because obviously they've got to hear a certain number of people in the day. They haven't got time to hear. Anyway, I played the exposition, was fully expecting to then get the thank you, but there was no voice. The pianist carried on playing, and I was like, oh, okay, concentrate. What comes next? What comes next? Anyway, I got to about halfway through the development, and I was thinking, if they don't stop me in about the next 2 minutes, I'm going to run out of notes because I don't remember what comes next. Unfortunately, just before that happened, they asked me to stop. But the moral of the story is just learn the whole thing, because you never know. You never know. And it was presumably because it was going well. They wanted to hear more. So, that was a positive thing, but it was also a little bit scary too. Wow.
A former colleague of mine was in an audition situation where he was in one of the 2 warm-up rooms, doing his warm-up, and the person in the next room he realised was playing a different movement from the concerto. At which point he realised he'd learnt the wrong movement. So now, that's the Mozart concerto. Some amazing insight, Adrian, and some really great ideas to kind of begin your learning process with the piece. Your life in the RSNO, Scotland's National Orchestra. Here we are in the heart of Glasgow. What's your actual favourite repertoire to play?
Oh my goodness. That's a really interesting question, how to choose. Well, I think over the years what I've realised is that a symphony orchestra is capable of making some amazing sounds. And we have such a wide repertoire. It's always sonically impressive to play those big sweeping works, you know, the sort of Strauss tone poems and such like. And for sort of pure naked volume and sort of making a sonic impression in terms of the full force of a symphony orchestra and the scope that can bring is impressive. But the more that I go along in life and sit in an orchestra, the more that I come to the conclusion that I find more satisfaction and actually more power in music that has clarity and has a tonal spectrum that is lighter and in a way more variable in its colour. So I'm thinking composers such as Schubert, Mendelssohn, Mozart, Debussy, who's, as composers, I think they've found a language which is just taking the possibility of the palette that an orchestra can provide and using it usually at the sort of the lower end of the dynamics and the sort of more softer expressions that for me actually satisfy me more. Whether it's just a personal thing that I just find more love in that music. Sometimes I feel that one gets more back from music that makes you go to the music, as in you're having to work to listen rather than the music coming at you with its drive and force.
Yeah, so you must have really enjoyed working in this environment over recent months with the slightly smaller forces.
It's true. I mean, I've always found enjoyment in the more chamber orchestrally sized ensemble. I think the other thing, repertoire-wise, that I have always thoroughly enjoyed is when we have singers in. Partly because I think you can learn so much from their sound production and the different colours that they can make. You know, we've been very lucky and had Karen Cargill come in a couple of times now and doing song cycles with us. And I you know, some of my favourite experiences sitting in an orchestra has been with singers. You know, some of the Mahler song cycles, the Ravel, Scheherazade. The Berg, you know, and I think if I think back to some of my favourite ever concerts in this job, I would look at the two Wagner operas that we did, which, you know, to be able to work with singers like Bryn Terfel and Christina Gerke and Karen Cargill, just extraordinary. Of course, the music is amazing too, but I think I find that I learn a lot from listening to singers, definitely.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, those Wagner operas were quite the event, weren't they? What are the elements that you think makes a great woodwind section? Obviously, a fantastic second player, but apart from that,
well, you jest, but you know, I've been in a very fortunate position here in this orchestra. It's very rare for you to be able to basically handpick your own section.
I suppose, yes, because it was, yeah.
Yes,
right,
yes.
yeah.
Just a side story. The day I joined the orchestra, within, I think 2 months of me joining the orchestra, the rest of my section had scrammed for the hills.
Was this something you said?
Which they told me to not take personally. But actually, of course, the positive out of that is I've been able to basically create a section that I'm really happy with.
That's fantastic.
But in terms of a general wind section, I think obviously you need players who can be soloists, because so much of the music that we're writing is soloistic. You know, one of the joys of being a wind player in orchestra is that we have our own line, our own part. So I think also what's really important is to have colleagues that you trust, but also have a mutual respect for, because a lot of what you do is blending your sound. You know, classic is the flute and the oboe, or the flowbow as we like to call it, or you know, flute and clarinet, oboe, bassoon. You know, quite often we're working together in pairs, or indeed the whole harmony wind group. So I think it's really important to have players who are flexible, who understand what their role is at any given time, because of course that it fluctuates depending on the music you're playing. I mean, as you know yourself, you for long parts of your playing, you're blending into something that's around you, and then suddenly you're having to project a solo line. So you really have to be able to do everything, and that's, yeah, it's rare to find people that can not just technically do everything, but actually musically and humanity-wise understand their position at any point, and how it relates to what's going on around them.
And I suppose that's part and parcel of the reason why those sort of positions take a long time to fill. You know, 'cause
yeah, of course, and often it's, you know, filling positions is not always about the candidates. It's often about what's already there.
yeah,
You know, if you can have something that would fit perfectly with one orchestra, but just for whatever variety of reasons doesn't fit with what's already in your orchestra. So it's not necessarily any skin off your nose if you don't get a job. It might be more a comment on what's already there rather than who or what you are.
the fire alarm goes off in a rehearsal. You're only allowed to take either your instrument or your phone with you. What do you leave behind? The oboe or the phone?
Oh, come on. You can get a new phone within 20 minutes at the Apple store, which is about 100 yards down the road. I mean, it's a jokey question, but in all seriousness, I actually, well, as you know, oboes, unlike string instruments, have quite a short shelf life. And they're such personal things, you know. I mean, my oboe feels like it's an extension of me. It took me 9 years to find an instrument that I was willing to transition from my previous.
Yeah.
So I think that probably answers your question.
Yeah, they're so strange over, especially like with myself, if I'm sort of advising students, it's when they sort of realise, oh my word, I'm spending this money on this instrument, but actually one to the next to the next to the next is a completely different beast. So, yeah, getting one that sort of feels like an individual fit can really take a long process, and they're almost, and as you say, they have a shelf life. So, are you thinking about your next one, or is that?
You kind of almost have to after a certain while, yeah, because the problem is as an instrument deteriorates, you're having to make adaptations to maybe your reeds or to the way that you're actually physically playing the instrument in order to cope with its ever-increasing issues. So yeah, I mean, after 5 years, I would start getting itchy, I think, about looking. I mean, as it happens, actually, this instrument here actually has a synthetic top joint, which, in theory, shouldn't wear out in the same way that a wooden one does. So, fingers crossed. I was going to say touch wood, but of course I can't touch synthetic plastic.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that will last a bit longer. But I mean. Of course, there's no such thing as a perfect instrument. We're always looking for something that's going to make our lives easy. I I think one has to accept that, like most things in life, it's give and take. And you might find an instrument. You know, we tend to look for instruments that do the things that our current instrument can't do, whatever that is. But then, of course, the flip side of that is that because it can do that, it can't do something that you're already used to. And so, you know, it's a balancing act.
Yeah.
You know, mix that in with the vagaries of reed making and how that changes. You know, from reed to reed, it's a bit of a minefield and a bit of an inexact science. But you know, we've muddled through for the last time.
You probably do you enjoy the kind of chaos factor of it?
It reminds me of one of my old teachers who had an oboist career of about 40 years. And when she retired, one of her colleagues said, "So, the reeds, right? Was it worth it?" And she thought about this question. She said, "Well, all in all, I would say just about not." So I don't know. I mean, it's one thing that is certainly true of the oboe is that it's a daily challenge, and I think because of that, you know, I can honestly say, I have never ever had a boring day's work, because it doesn't matter what music you're playing, it doesn't matter what the conditions. There's always a challenge there. There's always something there's always some kind of hurdle that you're trying to navigate with your setup.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's satisfaction to be gained. I mean, you know, don't get me wrong. I'd rather I didn't have to scratch away at pieces of cane in order to make my mouthpiece from a day-to-day perspective. But there is a satisfaction from when it does work, thinking, yeah, I made that, and now I can do my job, you know, and some people might like it.
Many people will like it. Yeah, it's quite, the idea that you can sort of make the last 10% of your oboe yourself every day, every note. Marvellous. Now, of course, in the RSNO, we have chair patrons. Many players in the orchestra have chair patrons. I myself have a chair patron who's the Witherby Charitable Trust chair. Kat Heathcote and Ian McNeil are amazing patrons, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about those guys at another time. But Adrian, your chair patron is a very unique individual, Mr. Headley Wright.
That's right. He's a lovely gentleman. He's in his 80s now, but he owns a distillery, which, you know, when I was told that my chair sponsor owned a distillery, I thought, wow, can't do much better than that. So yeah, in fact, at Christmas time, he used to give us a nice bottle of whiskey from his distillery, so that was rather nice. But it's lovely because what's especially lovely about my chair sponsor is that he was an amateur oboe player, so he dabbled in this fabulous instrument, and to you know, we've been able to have conversations about the sort of ups and downs of being an oboe player. He understands the issues with reed making and choosing instruments and whatnot, and so that's been lovely to have conversations, you know, be it in the interval in the bar, or he actually even sponsored me to perform the Vaughan Williams concerto with the orchestra. So it was lovely to be able to do that in the Usher Hall and then go straight off stage, go round and then talk to him about it, because it was one of his childhood favourite pieces. So
right.
Wow.
It's really nice as well that you often sometimes mention to me when we're on stage in Usher Hall just before we begin, you can sort of see him coming in.
That's right. There's something very, very supporting and very, very lovely about seeing obviously not just a friendly face in the audience, but a supportive face and someone that you know really is listening out and also understanding what it is that you're going through. And I think that this idea of going to our concerts and not just getting to know the music, but also getting to know the individuals that make the performance. I think it's a crucial relationship, and a very fulfilling relationship to understand, I guess, more what's going on the inside of a performance, as opposed to just being the recipient of from a distance. You know, you're sort of stepping into the environment.
Adrian, it's been fantastic to hear your thoughts on the piece, on the oboe, on life in the RSNO. Some brilliant insights and some really great advice for people beginning their path of studying the piece. So it's been fantastic to hear your thoughts, and the performance also is amazing to watch. So I hope everybody enjoys that, the Mozart Oboe Concerto with the RSNO and Adrian Wilson.